Paul Anderson Walsh. He's the co-founder of the Center for Inclusive Leadership, TCFIL. He is a skilled facilitator, author, broadcaster, inspirational speaker, and life coach. His clients come from a variety of sectors, including professional services, the arts, higher education, construction, policing, retail, not-for-profits, financial services, and healthcare. He's the ITN Productions Assistant Resident Leadership Expert for their Amazon Audible series, How to Outperform. He's also a BBC contributor and has a regular show on Premier Radio called Ask Paul. Paul is the former CEO of the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust and continues to work with various social justice projects. And he's also the founder and director of The Grace Project, a charity dedicated to working with people to help them discover their identity, resolve issues of self-worth and self-esteem. And he's written 3 books on the subject. Paul, we are so pleased to have you with us today as our keynote speaker, and I'm just going to hand over to you. Welcome.
Well, thank you and welcome. You forgot my most important job, which is chair of Ella. So
I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were an Ella chair too, man.
I have the great privilege.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I have the absolute privilege of working with Brian and Mike and Dan and Phil, and we really it's for me, and I'm smiling looking at Brian and Mike, who I can see on my screen. I'm sure Danny is on another screen someplace. But it's actually very exciting just to see all that we talk about at board level, and everyone says, "Oh, you want to see the growth? It's fantastic! It's amazing things happening." And to see you all on the screen is just such a joy, because it's such a tribute and such a testimony to the work that the Ella team are doing. So just wonderful. And I even see Peter Liner has a lockdown beard. Peter, very impressed. Good to see you. So, all right. Well, listen, I was delighted by Danny. I didn't kind of get the gig because I am the chair. I got the gig, I think, because I might have something to share with you about this idea of where we find ourselves at the moment. And I'm going to talk to you about essentially a kind of bit of a read on where I see the world and the universe right now, and I'd be just love to chat with you. What I'll do, and we'll kind of figure this out as we go along. Daniel, it seems like I don't know why you do this. You should be on TV. You're got the most effortless, skillful way of facilitating these things. I feel like I should be listening to you on the TV or radio or something. So I think if you don't mind just kind of playing this through, I'm happy to do this at a pace. Maybe we'll kind of do little sharing blocks and then stop and then have some Q&A stuff. We can do it entirely how you want. But I think the most important thing for me is to say that this is really a conversation, and hopefully it's a conversation that will be enriching for you. But you'll be the judge of that. So what's my theme? My theme is 2 pandemics, a paradigm shift, and a panacea. So what am I talking about here? Well, we find ourselves in a very, very, very peculiar story, do we not? Who could have thought? I'm thinking about when I was speaking at a conference this time last year, the world has changed almost beyond recognition. And I think that for me, when I want to define these 2 pandemics, and then the paradigm shift and the panacea, I put them this way to you. I would want to suggest to you they look something like this. The 2 pandemics, I think, are very clear in my mind. Those 2 pandemics have become, if you will allow me to say this to you, quantumly entangled. One of them is the issue of COVID-19 and the coronavirus global pandemic. And the other one is also a respiratory condition called racism, which is meaning that people simply cannot breathe. And both of those 2 things, I think, have come together and combined in a way that is really very, very extraordinary. There's a paper that Daniel and Nancy, I'll happily make available to you if you would like, called Waiting to Exhale, but where I was really thinking quite a lot about this, because obviously this is the world in which professionally I come from, where I work with organizations to help them to create environments where people can be their best selves on their own terms and do their best work. And the whole issue of structural racism is a serious, serious problem. And to be honest, it's been fascinating for me, because having spent so much of my working life very focused on the inclusion agenda and very focused around a much wider agenda, my real kind of almost single lens at the moment is actually trying to help organizations to really get under the skin, if you allow me to use that expression, and deal with this systemic problem of racism, because it's the greatest curse, the greatest blight that we have, and it's something that I fully believe we can resolve. I've been writing lots of papers and doing lots of lectures on it recently, so forgive me, you're going to get the kind of blowback from all the rest of the lectures I've been doing around that, but I hope it will be helpful to you. So the two pandemics, those I think I can prove to you very clearly. And what's the paradigm shift? Well, the paradigm shift is actually quite important, because I think the paradigm shift is Industry 4.0. Now, the thing is that we were talking so much about Industry 4.0 up until we started talking about Brexit, and then we started talking about something else. But that hasn't gone away, and you're going to see why that becomes important. And then I have this notion of the panacea, and I think the panacea, essentially this, I think the elixir of all of humanity's problems, is inclusion. Because I think inclusion is such a deep-seated, such a beautiful, it's a spiritual concept, it's a physical concept, it's an emotional concept, it's a commercial concept. At whatever level you look at it, there is a radical difference in tone, in feel, in shape between people that feel excluded and people that feel included. If I feel excluded from you as a community, what happens is this: if I work for you and I want to be included with you, then I promise you this, that I will only do what you have contracted to do, and I'll do what you pay me for. If I feel included amongst you, then I will do what you couldn't afford to pay me for, because I'll have that sense of belonging, that sense of ownership, that sense of wanting to be a part. And it's such an important issue. But let's see if we can kind of move this along at a bit of a pace, so we can kind of pause and have some chat as we go through. So the Industry 4.0 piece is important, because it's hard almost to imagine, I think, that it was only as recently as the 23rd of March. Listen to this. I'm going to think about the 23rd of March when we had our lockdown. So we went into lockdown 23rd of March. But imagine this, it was only as recently as 2014 that flexible working was extended to all UK employees. So to the idea of not having to go into the office to work was such an anathema to anybody. Nobody could even understand that. And what happened was, if you think about that, even 3 years prior to that was the birth of the technological age, as they call it, the fourth industrial revolution. And how was the fourth industrial revolution going to be characterized? Well, I think quite simply this: it was going to say to us that from henceforth, work will no longer be a place to which you go. Work will simply be a thing which you do. Now, when I was young, I said I was going to work. And what I physically meant was I was going to leave my home and I was going to go to some office or a shop or wherever it might have been, somewhere else. And it was going to work. Whereas now what's happened is work has come to us. It's a completely different environment. And whilst there were lots of organizations that were sitting on the fence about this, now, of course, COVID-19 has meant that that fence has just been completely broken down. And what's interesting is that if I think of some of my investment banking clients, the idea where presenteeism is such a premium in investment banking, we now have organizations like JP Morgan, where you have, for example, the brokers doing trading from in their kitchen at home. And it was like, how could that even be possible? Because the technology is there to support it. Of course it's possible, but we didn't think it was. And now our new world essentially is this, because I think what COVID-19 has done is it's not only induced the birth of telecommuting, it's not only induced that birth, I think it's cut the umbilical cord forever, freeing the knowledge worker from the womb of the workplace. I think that's finished, that's gone. Now the reality is, have laptop, will travel. It really is as simple as that. There is just no reason to do it. And I think that that's quite interesting, because that's become a very powerful shift. So COVID, I think, will be seen as a massive catalyst. But I would also say to you that the killing of George Floyd will become to be seen as the kind of midwife to a new birth of something very, very different and very new. This morning I was on the radio with Nick Ferrari talking about the Lawrence case, because the police have essentially made it the case inactive now, and that was they're sort of talking about what they think about that over time. And I think that it was so interesting when I think about, was the Lawrence murder the murder that changed the United Kingdom? Well, I think Macpherson would suggest that maybe it wasn't, because the Macpherson report that was generated in 1999 generated this series of recommendations that essentially said that the Metropolitan Police are institutionally racist. And so we all gasped, and lots of effort was done to do lots of good things around that. And I work with the Met Police, so I can speak well of them. But it is interesting that 20 or more years later, when Wendy Williams produces the Windrush Lessons Learned report, she concludes the Home Office essentially are as equally as institutionally racist, although she doesn't exactly use that language. What she says, it's yellow, it quacks, so it's almost likely to be a duck, about the same thoughtlessness, the same unwitting bias, the same ignorance, the same unequal treatment for Black people in the case of Windrush as we saw in the case of Lawrence. So that is disturbing. So actually the reality is that needle hasn't shifted in that sense. But I think what has shifted, and I think what makes this very exciting, is I think we have moved from this notion of being able to say, there was a time when I think white people were listening to us, and I was appreciative of that, having been a person of color wanting to tell our story, wanting to talk about social justice, reckoning that when I was chief executive of Stephen Lawrence Trust, I was wanting to get the conversation away from criminal justice and wanting to talk about social justice, because the truth of the matter was, had Stephen Lawrence got on the bus that night, and that bus had turned up on time, and he got on the bus and he'd not been murdered, he still would have faced a whole series of deadening social consequences that would have prevented him from potentially being the young architect that he wanted to be. So I think that what's interesting is that the shift has moved now, in my mind, from white people listening to us to white people listening as us. And I think perhaps for the first time in my memory, that shift has occurred. And I think that shift is very powerful, because for me, what I can see is I can see that this combination, this entanglement of COVID and Floyd has kind of pierced through the surface level of our consciousness and has touched us at the point of our human-heartedness. And I think that when people are touched at the level of their human-heartedness, it cannot do anything other than break forth in interpersonal love, in care about treating one another in ways that are dignified and humane and appropriate. And so I think for me, we're at this very interesting inflection point. I think we recognize that we're also in a liminal space. We're at that threshold before we kind of go in, and it's all a bit ambiguous and we're all a bit disorientated. And the most question I'm asked most often by by people is, what can we do? We don't want to say the wrong thing. We want to help. We're these clumsy, awkward advocates, but nobody really knows. We're in that liminal space. But I think what I want to say to you is this. I want to say to you that there is a moment for us, and I think we can grab it now, whereas we can actually see that there is a panacea, there is a solution, and that solution, I think, is inclusive leadership. And why it's so exciting to talk to you as a group of leaders, why I find this such a privilege to do, is because our leadership models are broken fundamentally. They simply don't work. The places I am looking to and have been looking to for my support, unfortunately, in the absence of statesmen, I'm left to make do with politicians. In the absence of leaders, I'm left to make do with managers. I'm even reaching out to my spiritual communities, only to discover that most of those have become religious workhouses. And actually what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a group of leaders that are actually able to say, we understand this is about how we treat people. We understand this is about creating environments where people can be their best selves and do their best works. And we understand that inclusion is that kind of magical moment where, if you will, them becomes us. Because make no mistake about it, we are in the most extraordinary times. We have something like 2.6 billion people in this world are in some kind of lockdown. We are conducting arguably the largest psychological experiment ever conducted in our human history. And the result is going to be quite serious. We're going to see an epidemic of burnouts. We're going to see absenteeism, and we're going to be entering into a very complicated landscape. And if ever there was the need for people to know how to lead with compassion, with empathy, with care, and with intelligence, it's going to be now. Because I promise you this, we'll see this, every commentator will be telling you this, the brutal facts are that we will be judged very, very, very
No, we all said the same. What do you think of our new building then?
Tracy, can you mute yourself, please?
Very lucky, aren't we? I'm listening to a conference, I am.
Tracy, you need to mute yourself.
We think it's really clear that we're going to get judged for the way we treated our people during this pandemic. No mistake about that. When you come out on the other side, that's going to be a very, very important conversation. So what I think I would like to do is maybe to kind of pause before I suggest to you what I think leading in liminal space might look like, and just check in with you, really, see if anybody wants to just ask anything or just share any comments. Daniel, I don't know if you've got anything on the chat that you would like, do you think would be helpful for folks to share with us, or whether you'd like me to carry on chatting for a little bit
Paul,
more?
I'm moderating this section, so
I'm sorry, Nancy.
Yeah, that's okay. So I do have a couple questions. One's from Rebecca. She's asking, does 4.0 mean that lower paid workers from developing countries can be employed for a wider range of home working jobs? Homes can be anywhere, lowering employment standards as they are exploited. What legislation from what country protects them? And then
yeah, I think 4.0, and I think that's the entire point. That this is the question. Whether or not we'll hold on to this post-COVID is an interesting question, because we might see a return to isolation. It's certainly one of the choices. But the notion of 4.0 is about flattening out is about globalization. So literally, it's about being able to get, and this can play both ways, right? I can contract cheaper services in Sri Lanka than I can in London, for example. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see things all stitched together. We're already seeing it, where we're making parts here and parts there. But potentially there are some, if I think that the social justice conversation that's around the human rights agenda is driven hard enough, it could be a really great opportunity. On the other hand, it could be the biggest disaster in the history of the world.
Yeah. I know, Nick, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to or not, but if I am,
yeah,
that's great.
yeah, you are. It's fine.
Yeah, I think one of the worries I have is that so much of the way we build relationships and break down barriers between each other is through, old-fashioned face-to-face contact and really listening and building relationships that way. So I hear and agree that we're more in need of this kind of leadership than ever. I worry that it's harder to deliver than ever, and I just wonder if Paul has any thoughts on how we can overcome what seems like a huge challenge.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Nick, and I think there's something for me about recognizing that how do you make sure that people still feel a part when we're a part? How do we actually do that? And I think that it feels to me like you've almost got to sort of turn the dial up a little bit, because I don't happen to believe that physical distance necessarily needs to equate to emotional separation. But I do think that you have to work much harder to create that level of proximity. So I think that, for example, this will come as nothing but joyous news to you folks. I think we've arrived at the age of the facilitator, because I think now the ability to be able to facilitate people to meet virtually is going to be the great skill. Of the last century, it might have been training, but now it's about facilitation. Can you make virtual environments actual? And you can, the tools are there, but it requires a level of sophistication and a level of training. And one of the things that I would be really keen, I know Danny is massively alive to this, is to really be thinking about how we can facilitate space for each other. Because yeah, I think you're right. What you get, Nick, which is useful in something like Zoom, is we've got the opportunity to put a whole group of people together from all over the place, all over the world, come to that, in a frictionless way. And you get voice on a platform like this, but what you don't get is touch. And it's about how we can replace the touch that I think is going to be the really, really important piece. And that's going to be about your ability to create those environments where people feel really psychologically safe, which I think is going to be the big theme that will come out of the back of COVID. But yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure, Nick, if I read, I'd be fascinated to know what your organization's thinking, but if I look at the trends with our major clients, the RTO proposition, the return to office proposition, none of our clients are really thinking about that until at least spring 2021. Not even interested. And you say, well, okay. And it takes, and I think then, I've got organizations where they're currently looking at their leases, and a lot of them are cutting the size of their offices, recognizing that they're never going to go back to the pre-COVID shape. What they might end up with is half the office size, and they might end up with people coming in 1 or 2 days a week. But it feels really unlikely to me, certainly from what I'm seeing in our space and what I'm reading, it seems really unlikely that we're going to see a return to pre-COVID behaviors. I think that's really unlikely. So we're going to have to figure this out. And that's why I think there's an advantage for the facilitator. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, we have lots of questions. So I don't know if you want to keep going or you want to take a few more questions or.
Let me see here. I've got, why don't I push on a little bit and
okay.
then we'll come back in again.
Yeah, we have time for Q&A. So just, there's some really good questions in the chat. I just don't want to lose out on them, but.
No problem.
Yeah, press on.
Let me press on just a little bit further.
Okay.
Am I screen sharing again? Hopefully I am.
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
All right. So here's this proposition then, and I think maybe let's just kind of see if we can break this out a little bit, because what is actually going on? Well, I think it's something like this. It looks like there are these this is a sort of liminal space, Snake, where we're trying to think, this is as a practice, we're trying to think about what we can see. So we know we've had this first wave, the immediate impact, fear, illness, we've seen all of that, and of course, horrifically, if we look at the numbers of deaths that we've had as well. Then we think there's something about this social and economic impact. I mean, that's stacking up against us. Our figures in the UK are horrendous. 730,000 people have been made unemployed since March, or whatever the number is. We think there's some really big issues around indirect results. So what do they say? 20 million operations stacked up at the NHS or something incredible like that. And there's all sorts of really very serious unintended consequences. But then there's this big choice that we're going to be confronted with. And I think this is maybe the main point, that we will have to decide what kind of people we want to emerge on the other side of COVID. And I think it's a really, really big question for us. Do we choose a nationalistic future, which is all about exclusion and isolation, and borders and separation? Or do we forge a kind of better future together, which is a conversation about inclusion? I know I spent many an hour talking with Brian about this, and I know how passionate Brian is around this inclusion agenda. And Brian, I think that the choice between this kind of psychological contraction or this psychological expansion is going to be really, really important. And I think every one of us has a huge role to play, because this is the greatest, the worst thing that ever happened to us is that we contract and isolate. That would be the worst thing. But no, let me get into the next time about Brexit and all the rest of it. I'll try to stick on message. So we're using this workbench in my office to think about how we are trying to support our clients in their journey from what we call lockdown to liftoff. And so we see us in this kind of remote model at the moment, where the big thing is about the big risks for organizations, I think, are about right sizing, and they're trying to figure out how do they actually make the organizations right side up. And that could be space, it could be numbers, and this is kind of quite an aggressive period we're living in the minute. But there's also a big issue going on about retention, because if you've been on a 70, 80 hour a week cycle, and you've been going back and forth to London or Birmingham or Manchester, wherever your city might be, and suddenly you're kind of at home with your feet up in the Cotswolds doing your work from your laptop. Well, I'm going for a walk on the beach every day. What the hell are you going to do? Going back to work in London 70 hours a week? No one's going to do that. It'd be crazy. So there's a lot of thinking about, hang on, what are we doing here? But of course, the remote working generates some issues as well. And then we see that there'll be this RTO proposition that will start next year, which will really be about returning, and then people thinking about how they manage risk and how they critically re-engage everybody, because I think that's going to be very, very tricky indeed. And then I think the retention issue will come to life again. And then, of course, the issue for organizations will then be about how they reinvent themselves and start rethinking. But one of the questions I think that we have to come to terms with, that we'll have to think about very seriously, is how we address the issue of performance continuity, because this is complex stuff. We've got to be asking ourselves some big questions, and they are about, do your people feel psychologically safe right now? And by psychologically safe, what I mean is, do people feel able to be candid about how they're really feeling? And this is a very, very tricky conversation. There's such a big difference often between what I will tell you and how I actually feel. But to actually be able to get into the soul of how I'm really feeling takes a level of psychological safety that is rare. And I think one of the things that I find so exciting about the Ella proposition is that when you break out and you meet in your issue groups and you build the communities that you do, what you're offering each other, and I don't know necessarily whether you heighten this in terms of the way even we sell the proposition or think about the proposition, but you are being invited into an environment which is absolutely bomb-proof in terms of its psychological safety. You have a group of people that care for you, and the ability for you to be able to use that space to really search and test and talk about stuff is an incredible privilege. What about health and well-being? We know that the emotional well-being numbers are going to go off the roof. How do we know our employees aren't suffering in silence? What about this business about social isolation? Are we really doing enough in terms of thinking about making sure, as I've said to Nick already, that people that are apart from us still feel a part of us? And what about change readiness? Change is a serious issue. I know we've got going to have a fantastic conversation about change later on today. And I think that Emma's going to be talking to us about that. But that whole notion of actual change readiness is fundamental, because remember this, people are not like light. We don't all move through the world at the same speed. We all have our own different speed and pace of change. And this is going to be a very serious conversation. And then fundamental question really, is about saying, well, look, are we actually supporting people? Do the people have the right tools to be able to do their work? So one more bit from me, and then I'll perhaps we'll go back to the questions. And that is to say, okay, I have said to you that there are these two pandemics, and I could lay them out. I could certainly lay the systemic racism out one a lot. I could lay that on a lot thicker for you, should I wish. The COVID one, I think we're all home on. The paradigm shift is the 4.0. But what I'm suggesting to you now is actually that the real panacea, the thing we need to embrace and grab together, is this idea of what it would mean to lead our organizations inclusively. We have a little inclusion omitter, I often describe this of, when we're talking to clients about why clients come to this agenda. And I talk about it in these language. I say that we have, some come to us as what I describe as being the pragmatists. So they come because their driver is about compliance, right? They just want to make sure they realize the return isn't very high for them, but the risk is massive. So for example, now, for instance, what you're seeing in the marketplace amounts to panic buying of unconscious bias programs, with organizations running around to kind of try and deal with their white middle class angst about I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist. So they go, look at me, we've got an unconscious bias training program. Phew, and they're always relaxed and think that was good. It's pointless, save your money. The paranoid come because their key driver is competition. What worries them is they're worried about the fact that if I don't get this right, my employees will leave my investment bank and go down to Old Street and work in a startup tech and bring their dog to work and all the rest of it. So what drives them is the paranoia. And then we have the people that we call principled, and these people are interesting because these people say, no, this agenda is important because this is about congruence. This is about making sure that we're living in a world where there's no disconnect between what we believe and how we behave. And making sure that that disconnect doesn't exist is really very profound for them. And then we have the prescient, which are the kind of principles plus people. And what they see is they see one additional driver that's really important. Yes, they know the agenda is morally right, and they know it's socially responsible and socially desirable, but they also understand that inclusion is business critical. They know that. They know it's critical to driving their organization because their organization is about people. So for them, when they think about it, they think that way around. Because what they know is this. They know that people that feel included are more likely to be believers than cynics. They know that. They know that people that, when they're included, will make a difference rather than look for something different. They know that people who are included will be volunteers rather than conscripts. They know that included people fight for their organizations rather than fight against them. They know that people that include solve problems rather than just point them out. And they know that people that are included are fundamentally contribution focused rather than compensation focused. And the reason this is so important is that unlike diversity, unlike equal opportunity legislation, which all gets melded into one. Never ever forget this one point. Inclusion is an emotion. And if you understand that, then you understand something very, very radical indeed. And let me tell you, what inclusion does for you, when you do this well, inclusion creates an environment where you can be who you are. You can be your authentic self. And may I say this to you? The most common form of despair is not being who we are. And the thing that inclusion gives you that nothing else will give you is it gives you that ability to be you. And when I'm me, then I can do my best work. When I'm me and I've been accepted by you and I belong with you, I feel trusted, I feel valued, I feel safe, then I will do for you for free what people wouldn't do for you for money. So last thought for me, and then I'll take some questions, and then I'll perhaps do a little bit of work with you about talking about how we think about managing inclusion in organizations. But let me just offer you this to finish this entanglement point. What is so interesting to me is that when I look at COVID and I say, okay, this is what you're supposed to do in COVID, it's so fascinating because the very thing that we're supposed to do to protect us from the respiratory disease that is COVID is the very opposite of what you need to do in order for us to defeat the disease, the respiratory disease that is racism. Allow me to show you. When it comes to COVID, the advice is to wear a mask. When it comes to dealing with racism and systemic bias, you need to take off all the metaphorical masks. Just take them off. When it comes to COVID, you've got to cover up. When it comes to dealing with racism, you've got to stop covering and face the uncomfortable truths. When it comes to COVID, you've got to limit contact with other people. When it comes to dealing with racism, you've got to increase our connection with people who are other. When it comes to COVID, you've got to keep your distance. When it comes to dealing with racism, you've got to find ways to get together. When it comes to COVID, if anyone in your household has symptoms, you all need to self-isolate. When it comes to dealing with structural inequality, we need to reduce the psychological distance between us. When it comes to COVID, PPE, that stands for personal protective equipment. And these are garments, equipment essentially designed to protect the wearer's body from injury or infection. But when it comes to dealing with structural inequality, PPE means something different. It means you have to live by principles and not pragmatism. It means you have to put people before profit. And it means you have to strike out for equity, not exclusion. And that's a way of being that's designed to protect others from injury. And when it comes to COVID, wash your hands regularly. When it comes to dealing with racism, nobody can wash their hands of that because we're all in it. Let me stop for a minute and take a few questions.
Well, I have a couple really good questions in the chat. One is from Sonia. She talks about what role does activism play in this extraordinary time in history?
It's the key issue. It's the absolute key issue, because I think that the thing that I keep hearing all the time is people keep telling me they're non-racist. Well, I'm really pleased to hear that. But non-racist is not the same as being anti-racist. Because the thing is, it's not enough to say that I'm neutral. I want you to be neutral. I want you to be activated and engaged. And I think, so for me, activism is absolutely everything. But activism, Nancy, I think is a result of a kind of coming together. I think what happens is that I think that the point I made a little bit earlier, when you touch someone at the level of their human-heartedness, they will be triggered, they will be activated. I have never, ever, ever, ever seen anybody whose heart has not been touched, and simultaneously the result is that they are then not moved into action. It's just as it will happen. When I think when that happens, I think it becomes super powerful, because we are activists, but we've been deactivated and desensitized by all the distractions and the noise and everything around us. But activism is everything, because unfortunately, if I may say it this way now, Nancy, I think we need to take the lead on this. I wrote to an American, was writing for an American magazine the other day, in-house lawyers, and I ended by saying, we the people need to be the ones that stand up and take the move here. And if you look at across the world right now, all of the really big shifts in society are activism driven. 16-year-old girls. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement. That's led by a 15-year-old girl, right? It's not, don't expect the politicians to lead on this, because they're not going to. Politicians don't lead, they follow.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm going to take a question that Daniel put in the chat. And thanks for that. I mean, yeah, I just agree. And thanks for raising that question, Sonia. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let me go back up to Daniel's question, because he was on the first questions here. I'm just trying to find it. Oh, Daniel asked, how does Industry 4.0 prevent causing deeper schisms between knowledge workers and manual workers who tend to be from poor and BAME backgrounds?
It's a great question. I think it's a really smart question. I think we're going to have to be very careful about that, if I'm honest, because I think that if you look at COVID, you'll see that I was on a call for one of my clients, Bloomberg, and there was a lady, a brilliant woman from Morgan Stanley, and she said, "Here I am in New York," she said, "and I haven't been out of my apartment for however many months." She's like, "I get up each morning to do my stuff. I look out of the window, and who are on the streets? Poor Black people who are the key workers, the frontline workers." She goes, "We're completely insulated from it. It just doesn't touch us." So I think COVID itself is a problem, but I think the 4.0 is an even bigger problem, because I think that we're going to have to do, and I really would want to talk to charities about this, one of the big things we're going to have to do some work around is digital inclusion. Because if people are digitally excluded, you will not be able to make it in this world, because that is going to be the currency of our day. And so I think digital exclusion, along with various other forms of exclusion, when it's financial exclusion or whatever, but digital exclusion is massive. And candidly, that will cause the great separation. And I think we could be in a chasm between those two. So I think it's a great question.
Okay, I have another one from Abby. And she says, what can we do to promote compassion and optimism when things are so challenging and there's such a divide in society, often that's exploited rather than soothed by our politicians? That kind of goes.
Yeah, I think, Abby, that's a good question. I think it's a really nice question. I think there's something for us about recognizing that it's about us as individuals working in our own area of influence. So I think that if each one of us on this call, how many there are of us on the call, 62 of us or whatever on this call, if each and every one of us was committed to being, personifying compassion, care and empathy in our own 62 individual areas of influence, imagine how quickly we could escalate that, because it's about, the power of one stuff. And so I think it's about being active in your environment and in your space and in your home and your neighborhood, in your street and so on and so forth, and in your organization. I think it's really powerful. There's a really lovely story that I remember hearing many years ago about this man who used to walk each day on the beach, and he would walk over the sand dunes and kind of walk down through off to where he would go. And each day he would watch this young boy who was seeming to be doing this kind of aerobic exercise, and he would kind of bend down, get up, make this throwing gesture, bend down and do this. And he would do this every day. He went past, he saw this boy doing it. And curiosity got the better of him one day, and he decided to go down to the beach to where the boy was and to see what was going on. And what he saw was that when he got there, the beach was absolutely combed with starfish. I mean, it was just carpeted with starfish. And he went to the boy and he said, "What are you doing?" And the boy said, "I'm saving the starfish." So the guy said, "What do you mean saving the starfish? There's millions of them. What difference can you make?" And the boy, without kind of interrupting his flow, did that same aerobic gesture again, bent down, picked up a starfish and threw it into the sea. And the boy said, "Well, I don't know, but I made a difference to that one, didn't I?" And I think that's the reality, that we can make a difference to the people that we're with. So no, but good question, Abby.
Yeah. Paul, I don't have any more questions in the chat. So unless I've missed any, if I've missed any, raise your hand or unmute yourselves and go ahead.
So my about the authenticity piece of your inclusion, I worry a little about people who are authentic to their true inner not very nice person, shall we say. So what about people who are authentically racist? We don't necessarily want them to encourage them to be their true selves.
Yeah, see, yeah, I accept that, but in a way, I'd rather know you're authentically racist than you telling me you're not. At least I know I'm dealing with. One of the differences between working here and working in the US is here I don't know who the hell is racist. At least in America I do. I'm clear about that. But I think there is something about, if I know that you're authentically racist, then there is an opportunity for us to have a conversation to begin to explore why.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's actually quite helpful in a way. And I think I also happen to believe that whether it's racism or whether it's anything else, for me that is a symptom of your own wound. To me, that's a symptom of you not being able to deal with the harm that caused to you by your own self-consciousness. And so I think that if I'm going to deal with someone who is racist, I have a choice. I can either include them or exclude them. And I don't know necessarily whether it's profiting me too much to exclude in that way. Now, of course, I'm not going to take that to a dramatic level, but at a core level, I think it's quite important because it's funny. I'll show you a couple of models that we use in our client conversations that might kind of push this a bit further, John, if I may. Let me just go back to the deck. When we're working with clients, we recognize that, well, firstly, we think that inclusion is this idea, is this notion of, as I've already said to you, of it's about me, you, and us. And it's the idea of when them becomes us. And inclusion in our head is this, we call this flower of inclusion, that people feel these things. I talked to you about this at last year's conference, if you were here, where people feel respected and they feel valued and they feel safe and they feel trusted and they have a sense of belonging and they can be their best selves and do their best work. But what's important about this is that if any of the petals are removed, any one, what happens is people begin to withdraw and begin to move out to the fringe and they edge towards the exit. And so it's worth me understanding what's happening for people to cause that sense of exclusion to take place. But we also recognize that people we work with are in different phases. We have what we call a maturity curve. And so the idea they may be coming to this conversation at the very initial stages, but they really don't know what they're doing. And they're just trying to figure it out. They may be in their organizations, D&I might be quite siloed, or they might be nascent, and they might have an intellectual understanding, but they kind of recognize something, but they haven't really got it together. Or they might be emerging, so they might be an organization that's quite grown about this, and they're starting to think about their blockers, or they might be maturing, which is in organizations that are taking a really strong look at this. But we step them across, when we work with clients, we work with them across these three conversations, and we try and say, let's see if we can understand where you are. So if you are an individual, and let's take the issue of wanting to make sure that we can deal with this racism point, John, to your issue, is that we would talk about making sure that you as an organization are prepared to boldly go, as we describe it. And for us, that's about saying the number one thing is we have to break down the barriers between us, whether they're visible or invisible, they have to be broken down. We have to find ways to open people's hearts as well as their minds. We have to learn to talk to each other and listen to each other in a clean way. We mustn't allow ourselves to be complacent just because we're non-racist, but we need to be activated to the question you asked me earlier on, Nancy, to be anti-racist. And then we need to lead ourselves, and we need to lead ourselves with humility, with empathy, with grace, and with compassion. And then we need to really commit ourselves to being the change we want to see in the world. And may I say, to be the culture carriers. We need to be the kind of super spreaders of this stuff in our sphere of influence. And you have much greater spheres of influence than you realize. You have much stronger networks than you realize. And just by being the change, you can make dramatic differences. So if I'm talking to an individual, I would ask you to just boldly go as an individual and live this way. If you're managing people and you have people responsibilities, I would say to you, the key thing is that your organization, your management style needs to be characterized by being a style that hears. What do I mean by that? I mean that in an inclusive organization, what we know for sure, we can be very clear about that, is that we all know that we are infected and affected by bias and prejudgment and stereotypes. But if you're an inclusive manager, a manager that hears, you'll learn how to interrupt that bias and disrupt and override that bias. We know that in an inclusive organization, the real secret of that organization is not, in fact, to treat everybody the same. The secret is to treat everybody equally well. And that's become really apparent to us during lockdown, because different people have very different drivers and needs. My needs are very different to the needs of my daughters, for example, who have got children at home and they're trying to balance their careers with their children at home. We don't have children at home. It's a different world to me. This is like the holy grail almost. I can sit at home and do my work and go in the garden. That's the best thing ever. So treating me equally well will be different from treating our children equally well. This authenticity piece, John, I think comes back here again, because I think where this starts to become interesting is the interplay. Because if you're a leader that hears, what we can say is that you will be authentic. And by the way, I'm not sure, John, however, how many of us know what it means to be authentic, because I think so many of us are living in a story that somebody else has given to us that actually isn't even our story, right? We've just kind of assumed it. It's a role we've been playing and a character we've been playing in a play we just don't understand. But not only am I authentic myself, but my real skill, my real gift to you is to give you the room to be authentic yourself. And that mutual fostering of authenticity, I think, has a very fine way of breaking barriers down. And then this notion about respect is about this sense of saying, it's not possible for me to, I don't think, be authentic, respect myself if I'm inauthentic. That's very difficult for me to do. And when I think about from a manager point of view, I'm thinking to myself, have I set the environment up properly so as I can be absolutely certain that when someone comes to talk to me, here's the question for you as leaders. How easy is it for people to talk to you and to tell you what they think freely, and think freely for themselves and as themselves in your presence? Or do they start doing the calculation of thinking, what would Danny like the answer to be? What's Mike want the number to be? What does Brian need the answer to be? Or can I just think freely for myself? It's a very interesting question. And that notion then becomes about respect. And then, Nancy, to your point, what happens is that if you look out on the H and the E, and then you look in on the A and the R, you will be an activist. There's no way around that. And you will seek to get value from inclusion by managing diversity, by getting value from inclusion.
Actually, oh, go ahead. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. No. Carry on. I have more questions, but
one last thing, and I'm done.
Yeah, no, please.
So if the individual, if the challenge to the individual is go boldly, the challenge to the manager is be a manager that hears. The challenge to the organization is I want you to listen to other people's questions. So what I would describe as someone who is other is someone who is not the majority ethnic or gender or aspect of diversity you might choose. And when other people come to you and they start looking at you, they ask some very fundamental questions. We call them the grace to lead questions. And here's the questions that other people ask. They want to know, number one, can someone like me reach my potential? Can I grow here? Can someone like me, working here with someone like you, reach my potential? Can someone like me achieve my goals working for you? Can someone like me really expect that I can belong here on my own terms, or do I have to become someone like you? The R is saying, can someone like me, and by the way, grace is about radical acceptance and non-judgment, by the way. And this is asking the question, can someone like me expect someone like you to reimagine your governance, your culture, your values, your behaviors, in order to make sure they benefit all of us, not just some of you? And could someone like me dare to believe that somewhere like this could actually be a meritocracy instead of just another meritocracy? Could someone like me dare to believe that someone like you wouldn't abdicate responsibility for your organization's values and for living by those values? If you're going to put, for example, as Ella do, love as one of our core values, then can someone like me believe that someone like you is going to be prepared to live to those values? Otherwise, don't have them. Can someone like me believe that you have enough humility to look at yourself and ask yourself whether you're living those values? And could someone like me dare to believe that someone like you would challenge inequality where you see it in the workplace? And the last two are about consciousness and education. So the last one is about saying, this one's about saying, could someone like me honestly believe that someone like you would be prepared to make the shift from, what shall we say, from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion. Could I dare to believe that? And could someone like me finally believe that someone like you would be prepared to educate themselves as to the needs and the issues of someone like me?
Yeah.
So if we're going to do something about making this shift and getting into a better place, and we recognize that we have these two pandemics, the COVID pandemic, the racism pandemic, we have this paradigm shift that is 4.0, each of which, by the way, are going to really highlight structural inequality. And I can promise you that in the equality queue, Black people will be at the bottom of that queue, because we're always the least and the last in every queue. I'm not meaning to be a victim, I'm just telling you how it is. Can we really be prepared to recognize that that's what we're looking at? Because if we want to do something about that, then the answer is inclusion, to create a society that is inclusive, where everybody can be their best selves, do their best work, and be on their own terms. And that means individually, you need to go boldly in this world. As a manager, you need to be a manager that hears. And if you are responsible for an organization, you need to create a culture that has the grace to lead. Yeah. So hopefully a couple of minutes left if anyone wants to ask.
Yeah, I have two people and their similar questions. Can you share solutions about how to increase from organizations that have been successful? This is from Liz, that really do work. And Rachel asked a similar, how do you do the principles, the HERE principles, how do you put those into practice? So how, solutions, what are some examples, and just some concrete examples how to put it into practice?
So, I mean, when we're working with organizations, we tend to work with them in increments. So it depends how we'll do it. So typically with an organization, we like to use a combination of two things. We have something called, we call it D&I squared. So we use data and insight. So what we do for organizations is that we measure the lived experience of people that work for them. That metric, that data is very useful to us, because what we do is we hold the data up against your values. So the company says, we're a place where everybody can grow, it's opportunities for all the rest of it. And we go, yeah, but the data doesn't say that. The data says that these people grow and those people don't grow. So is it a value or not? And they go, yeah, it's a value. So you're going to fix it or not? Well, no, we don't really want to invest that much money in it. Well, they don't call it a value. So we start with the data, and then we have the conversation, because you've got to, this is both, you have to make both the intellectual data and the emotional connection. And once you do that, and I think that's why I say this is an inflection point. Now we're pushing against an open door. For 20 years, we've had to really make this case. Now we don't. Everybody goes, oh, okay, just tell us how to do it. So I think there's a softness around this now that wasn't there before, but you do need the data, and you do need to be able to have the ability to facilitate very uncomfortable conversations, because you're working with a lot of angst and a lot of candidly white guilt around this, and it's very complicated.
Paul, I just wanted to say the question about activism wasn't from me, although I love the question. It was from Sonia. You keep saying Nancy, but it is one that I would have asked. So I just wanted to say that. I think we're going to have to finish it there, because it's time for the coffee break.